8-part series here in this auditorium that will feature a 35-minute segment on the singing brakeman Jimmy Rogers and a special appearance by Grammy-winning Louisville, Mississippi singer-songwriter Carl Jackson. To reserve your seat, register for free at mpbonline.org. And then on Saturday, September 14th, we'll offer a beginning genealogy workshop led by Curator of Research and Genealogy Joyce Dixon Lawson. The program will begin here in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, then move next door to the State Archives in the William Winter Archives and History Building. The cost of the workshop is $10. You can check the MDAH website for more details and registration information. August 28th is a significant day in the state's and nation's history. With us today to say a few words about why that is so is Pamela DC Jr., Director of the 2 Mississippi Museums and staff of these museums.
Good afternoon. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy, was senselessly murdered in Mississippi. His death served as a catalyst for the emerging civil rights movement. A Chicago native, Till was visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi when he was alleged that he assaulted a white woman. 4 days later, at approximately 2:30 a.m. on the morning of August 28, 1955, this 14-year-old boy was kidnapped from his great-uncle Mose Wright's home. He was beaten severely, he was shot in the head, he was tied with barbed wire, and his mutilated body was tied to a large metal fan and shoved into the Tallahatchie River. Today we honor Emmett. Today we honor his mother, Mamie. And today we stand in solidarity with all mothers who have lost their sons to treacherous racist acts of violence. Today we honor them all in a moment of silence. So if you all just bow your heads for just a moment, please. Thank you.
Thank you all. I hope that you will join us next week for History's Lunch when Max Garriott will present Fort Rosalie and the Natchez Indians in French Literary Imagination. Those of you who attended this year's Mississippi Historical Society meeting heard an abbreviated version of this, but I've been looking forward to hearing him with time enough to get deep on it. Today, we are delighted to have Roger Stolle to discuss his new book, Mississippi Juke Joint Confidential, House Parties, Hustlers, and the Blues Life. Roger Stolle has owned Cathead, Delta Blues, and Folk Art in Clarksdale since 2002. He is the author of Hidden History of Mississippi Blues and is a regular columnist for Blues Music Magazine, a contributing editor to Delta Magazine. Stolle has produced several critically acclaimed blues CDs and DVDs and co-produced the documentaries Hard Times, M for Mississippi, We Juke Up in Here, and Moonshine and Mojo Hands. Help me welcome Roger Stolle.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for coming today. And thanks so much for having me, Chris, in this wonderful museum complex. Also, thanks to the History Press for asking me to do a second book. They apparently didn't learn their lesson the first time. We thought we'd start today with just a clip out of We Juke Up in Here, which is a documentary I co-produced with a buddy of mine from St. Louis, Jeff Conkle, as well as a Jackson native, Damian Blaylock, and the guy that also shot the photos in both of my books, Lou Bope. Basically, this showcases some of the juke joints that we'll kind of be talking about. So it's about a two and a half minute clip.
juke joint to me is down home blues that's being presented to the public.
Well, juke joint was special because you smell a juke joint from a mile away.
When it all boils down, it's all about having fun, all about live entertainment.
And strangely enough, and I don't know how it happened, the first note on the guitar, the next note, the place is filled up.
In Mississippi, every town had bluesmen and juke joints, and this is the only one that's standing that I know of.
Juke joints are mostly like, let's say, going to church on Sunday morning and stuff. When it used to be in the old days, it used to be a lot of cutting and shooting going on.
You know, if I let the people come in and do what they want to do, this place wouldn't even be here.
Oh, yeah.
I run a tight spot.
Most juke joints in Mississippi at this point have either closed up shop or have converted over to DJs.
Live music is kind of slowing down. They mostly catering toward some electronic device.
But this is special here because this is where the blues started, and I'm gonna bring it back. Put it right back where it belongs.
The juke joint where I'm a-gwine, I'm out to have some fun. Juke joint where I'm a-gwine, I might have a good time. Yeah, the juke joint where I'm...
Those other places have something like some blues, but I have the blues. Yes, I'm proud to call myself the king of the juke joint runner, because I am the king. The juke up in here.
Stay right there, Jam. Now, is y'all feeling good?
Just so you know, it's not actually available on DVD anymore. It's out of print, so if you can find a copy, snag it. That last character who was talking was Red Payton, and today's Wednesday. Tonight, if you were in Clarksdale, Mississippi, he'll have Red's Lounge open, and he's a ridiculous character. So anytime you go to Red's, you gotta spend some time to try to talk to Red, and he may just not talk to you, but if he does, it's well worth it. But this is my store, Cathead in Clarksdale. If you haven't been there before, come on up. Basically, it was an excuse to have a platform to work from to try to promote the music. And I'm getting used to this remote here, so that's sort of the mess that is inside. But I've been in Mississippi, living here in Clarksdale, Mississippi for 17 years now. And I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I came via St. Louis. And one of the first questions I usually get is, well, how did you end up here? What brought you to Mississippi? And I have to go back really to when I was 10 years old. A guy named Elvis Presley died. And my parents didn't really listen to music, so there wasn't any music in the house. And suddenly his music was everywhere. He was on the front page of our newspaper in Dayton, Ohio, the morning and the evening edition that used to exist for an entire week. So I was curious about it. So I started taking my 50 cents a week allowance to Sears, which at that time had records, which happened to be back again. We call them vinyl now, but still records. And I'd buy these little 45s. Well, I still have them, and they're all blues records. They're all blues covers and R&B covers that Elvis had done. So I was getting blues, I just didn't know it had a name. Sort of got directly into blues a little bit later in life, go away to college in Cincinnati, went back to Dayton. I stumbled into advertising and marketing, and that took me to St. Louis, Missouri in February 1995. So shortly thereafter, I decided to start trying to really do the Dead Man Blues tour, honestly. I thought it was all gone. And, in St. Louis, you're 5 hours from Mississippi. So I thought I'll come down, I'll see where my heroes came from, Son House and Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters and guys like that. And lo and behold, there were still some guys around, still guys playing. It just was not on a reliable schedule type situation. But one of the very first, real blues experiences I had in my life was at a juke joint in Tullahoma, Mississippi. There was a guy named Junior Kimbrough who passed away, I think 1999. But he had this junior's place, juke joint out in the middle of nowhere, Tonyia, Mississippi, that ran some Sunday nights. And I had sort of gotten into some folk art, I'd gotten into blues and things like that. When you walk into this juke joint, the walls are covered in folk art. The music is absolutely the deepest blues I'd ever heard. And, you know, the audience was there for that. It wasn't like a festival or something. It was like a real deal community experience. So it kind of blew my mind. Oh yeah, there was Moonshine as well. But it kind of blew my mind. I just couldn't forget about it. I couldn't stop, you know, talking about it when I got back to, you know, the advertising world of St. Louis. So after 6.5 years of visiting and looking for those experiences, getting to know people, honing in really on Clarksdale specifically because of the, you know, people always say, oh, you must love the blues to, you know, have moved there. And I do, but it's the people. And I would say that for other towns as well in Mississippi, that somehow Clarksdale just really clicked with me. Like Southern hospitality is such a real thing there. You know, you didn't know if everybody really wanted you there till you moved there, but they acted like they did. So I did. So I moved there in 2002 and started really trying to work from the ground with a mission. My mission, everything that I work on, the book, the movies, the store, festivals like Juke Joint Festival that I'll talk about, all this is about one thing. It's the mission to help organize and promote the blues from within. Pull the scene together enough that you had something to promote for what we'll call tourists, blues fans from around the world, but you had to pull it together first before you promoted it so you didn't overpromise. So when they get there, there is live blues at night, or there is a festival, or there is something to do during the day that is reliable. And probably shouldn't say this, but like we have a couple businesses that this time of year is pretty slow, and I'll call up my buddy Stan Street and Deke Harp, who have a blues art gallery and a harmonica store. Some days I'll send them people, and they'll come back and be like, they're not open. So I'll call them. It's like, well, it was slow, so you know, I went fishing or whatever. But it's that kind of thing. You have to build it and be reliable. So I started trying to work with the club situation that we had at that time. Officially, actually, for 7 years, I booked Ground Zero Blues Club, which was new at the time. But then unofficially, and I always use air quotes, so they're important here, I worked with Red to try to get him on a schedule. Now, Red runs a real juke joint. He was never on a schedule. It was always a word-of-mouth thing. He would call me at like 4 on a Saturday afternoon, Big Jack's playing tonight. Now, who the heck am I going to tell at 4 o'clock that Big Jack's playing tonight? You know, I had tourists all day long or whatever. So it's trying to put things on a schedule, make them reliable. So I started doing free flyers, first for him and then ultimately for anybody who was willing to do music. This is before I started doing something that I now call Sounds Around Town, which is a heavy list that I do every week that we print, distribute, we have in the newspaper, online, that documents what we now have. You know, we went from maybe 1 or 2 blues shows a week in 2002 to 365 nights a year in Clarksdale. Christmas night, we had blues. At Hambone, he was willing to open up. And we had 9 tourists and 6 locals. But you can bet they were happy, and the act made $135, so he was happy. But that's not a natural thing. I mean, anywhere really. It may have been the only blues show in America on Christmas. I don't know. But it was also, I should say this, is a personal thing for me. It was an excuse to be part of the music scene that I love so much and get to know the people that I really value so much, get to know them personally. Guys like Red, who I will absolutely poke fun of because he would do it to me. And then a lot of the different blues characters as well. So working with the clubs, the juke joints, and then also starting to sort of design, produce, co-produce festivals. And we now have over a dozen festivals per year in Clarksdale. Actually, this year we had like 17 special events, many of which were festivals. The biggest right now, although it did rain this year, I have to be honest about it, it was a serious storm, is Juke Joint Festival in April. And Juke Joint Festival was not only an excuse to book the kind of blues I love in the kind of places that I love, but it was a way to just put the word right out front and really promote it. And one of the beauties of the first year, it's been going on since 2004, was one of the components at night is we have a wristband, and you can get in all the juke joint venues, some of which are actual real deal juke joints with history, and some are more modern clubs or restaurants. But that first year, Reds, for example, I dropped by to check on them, and the wristband gets you a ride on our shuttle buses as well. The bus pulls up, and 6, I'm just going to say they were elderly white ladies, got out, but they were protected by their wristband. So it was their first time in their entire lives going to Reds. But it was cool because they just felt like, okay, I have this permission to go here, I guess, or whatever you want to say. And it was just funny to see kind of the smiles on the band's face, and Red and his barman and stuff. And then, those ladies were having a great time. But it's just kind of just trying to get it accepted locally as this is something we want to promote. And come in here, so when you see tourists, you don't say, well, I don't know, I wouldn't go there, that's dangerous. Instead, you got to go there, that's the real deal. Because as Red said in the trailer we just showed, it used to be a lot of cutting and shooting. Now it's like going to church, because it's basically all his crowd's old, they're not going to do anything anymore, So, those were kind of some of the mechanisms I started using to try to promote the music, try to pull it together and then promote it. Throughout the year, we have, like I say, a whole series of festivals, and most of the festivals I'll do something either officially with the festival or separately out front of my store. You can see, lots of excited tourists from around the world. Juke Joint Festival in particular has attracted as many as 28 foreign countries just for that weekend, which is pretty insane. So in addition, after sort of getting more of the music scene going, then I started trying to work on projects that document, but again, I'm a marketing guy, so to me, I don't want something that's just going to be on a shelf. I want something that's going to motivate you. I mean, you all live in Mississippi, but if you don't, get on an airplane or get in a car and come experience a Clarksdale, Mississippi, or the Mississippi Delta, or Jackson, Mississippi, where there is an absolute blues scene. So these are things that document something, sometimes a moment in time, but also hopefully motivate people. In 2008, one of the films that could have just as well been called Juke Joint whatever, because it had enough juke joints in it, M for Mississippi, we had it out like 3 days, and we had mailed off pre-orders, and I had a lady from North Carolina call, and she's like, we're in our car right now, we're coming, we're going to visit every place in the movie. And it's like, well, I can't guarantee they'll all be open the night you're here, but that kind of thing is like, it's authentic marketing. I don't know, it's not, it's selling what is real and trying to get people to experience it in a real way. One of the things, I was having this conversation earlier with one of the ladies who showed up here early to get a good seat, that at least when I'm talking about blues, what I really will tell people is there's blues, the genre. In other words, I can play a blues song. Anybody can play a blues song. Anybody can feel the blues. But there's blues, the culture where the actual blues music comes from. And that's really what I've been most interested in trying to sort of organize, promote, perpetuate, document. Because for a guy like me, believe me, growing up in the suburbs of Ohio, to suddenly be at a Junior Kimbrough's Juke Joint in Tullahoma, Mississippi, if something happened to me, my mother would never find me kind of thing, was a real experience. It was like an Alan Lomax moment, walking into a history book, things I had read about, you're walking into it. So these projects, as I was saying earlier, one of the great things about it is I've gotten to work with, hang out with my blues heroes, many of whom are sadly gone now. So it's been just an amazing experience. The photo, well really, the photo in the center with my silly face, and then next to it the guy in the white suit, the guy that's next to me and next to him is Gip Gibson. And he has a juke joint in Bessemer, Alabama, so kind of near Birmingham. He may be as old as 99 years old. I don't think we really know. Gravedigger, strong man until he wasn't. He's actually in what sounds like hospice care right now. But his juke joint's been running since the 50s. It's basically a shack in his backyard. And one of my customers, Don Gentry from Jackson actually, talked Red into going, so I went as well. So we went over there, and you talk about characters. You got a guy who's like 90 who owns a juke joint. You got Red, who's Red. So it was just a real great experience. But I'm really sad to hear that it's kind of seems to be nearing its end as a venue and perhaps Gip himself. But these are the folks I've gotten to hang out with for years, which is just super special to me. From the book, you'll see several photos in here that actually come from the book. I think this one's in there. Dewdrop Inn, a great example of a juke joint in Shelby, Mississippi. It was sort of headed on its way out a little bit anyway, but I think when the Highway 61 bypass, the 4-lane came through, that probably sealed its fate. But it's a good example of a place that, starting roughly in the 60s, is what I was told, had fairly regular live blues. Guys like Wesley Junebug Jefferson, and Robert Bilbo Walker used to play there. Just a lot of regional and area and local bands. And through time, this juke joint, places like Smitty's Red Top and Margaret's Blue Diamond, places like that in Clarksdale, the audience, well, let's just talk about kids today. How many kids today are listening to blues? I mean, it's not enough. It's not many at all. Particularly in the African American community, it's just not the pop music that it once was. So as the demographic that was going, which typically tends to be older, either stops going out or frankly passes away. I know in Red's case, I can't even keep up with all his former customers who passed on. So you have that kind of going on. You have young kids saying, well, that's my grandparents' music, or maybe it's even my grandparents' music at this point. I like, hip hop or rock or country or whatever. In addition, and I'm not slamming the gaming community at all when I say this, but the casinos took a big bite out of juke joints, at least in the part where I live, according to the juke joint owners. Red Payton, for example, at Red's, if you're there tonight, for example, again, live blues every Wednesday, the stage is a carpet remnant. It's kind of colorful, so you find yourself kind of staring at it like, that is an interesting carpet remnant. And then it hits you, that's casino carpet. So I'm not saying how he got it, but he was laying carpet up at the casinos when they were really coming on early 2000s. And in addition to somehow getting that carpet, he would see customers that he hadn't seen in a while in his place. And it sort of dawned on him, they're not going there for blues, there's no blues, but it's the entertainment dollar. You only have so much to spend, so I'm going to go to a nice, clean place with a buffet versus, if you've seen Red's bathrooms, you know what that's about. So those kind of factors have led to places like the Dewdrop Inn becoming just a bar. It is still a super cool bar, though, I would just tell you, in terms of just the building. If you ever find yourself in Shelby, Mississippi, and I hope you do, if you go into not the front part, which has now been closed off into like a bar you can actually air condition, there's a big back part, and there are cool murals painted on the inside walls from probably the 60s, early 70s. And that kind of thing is what I really love, that true juke joint art. One that's not too far from here, relatively speaking, in Tonyia, Mississippi, which is a town about the size of the population in this room, I suspect at this point. This is Mississippi's longest running juke joint. So Jimmy Duck Holmes, who's in the red jacket there, he was born in 1947. The juke joint opened up in 1948. His parents opened it. Apparently, previous to that, they had been running one kind of in their side yard where, his mom would fry some catfish and take it from the house into this other structure. But they finally got downtown, as much as there's a downtown Bentonia, and opened this cafe, which doesn't necessarily always have reliable live blues, but when it does, it's incredible. And Jimmy Duck Holmes is the last of the Bentonian bluesmen, which is a particular sound, particular tuning, really, that started in the, post-World War I anyway. And the 71st anniversary of the Blue Front, should you want to attend it, I think is September 21st or 22nd, whatever that weekend is. So it's definitely something to check out. He's a fascinating guy to talk to. Super nice. I send tourists there all the time. This is Paul Monkey's Lounge. Willie Seabury was Paul Monkey. And I know it's a side shot, so it's hard to read the signs on the front. But one of my favorite things about juke joints, oftentimes, and like Queen of Hearts here in town is like that, where it has directions what not to do, basically. Sometimes on the wall. This time he didn't even wait till you're inside to tell you. If you had your hat like this, or you had your pants, sagging a little bit, let's just say, and your underwear showing, well, you had paintings of those on the front of the building, and it said, not like this, and not like that. So it's, I always, coming from advertising, I appreciate clarity of offer, to know exactly what to expect. But he ran this place, I'm pretty sure he told me once, he used the year 1963. I don't really know, but for just decades. And Thursday night was basically the party night, the family night he called it, although I'm not sure how many families you would want to bring in there necessarily for that, but it was certainly an adult family fantastic experience. It was primarily a DJ. He was not a big fan of dealing with musicians, is how I took it. But in the last decade of its existence, Delta State University's Delta Center for Culture and Learning in Cleveland, particularly Dr. Luther Brown, Dr. Henry Outlaw, the coolest professor name ever, Henry Outlaw. They would get some money together occasionally and basically, in most cases, I would just help book somebody into there, but like real deal guys on a real deal juke joint. but it wasn't set up to have a band. There was like a little DJ booth in the back. So you'd see this like 3 or 4 piece band kind of jam back in there, and you're like, where is the drummer? But it was just a cool experience. Absolute fire trap. You know, he had, because he was Paul Monkey, people for decades brought him stuffed monkeys. And so they were all hanging up there along with the orange extension cords, you know, because there was no conduit. And of course, there was all this dust and grime. He was a cigar smoker. So if I had owned it, or frankly, probably anyone in here, it would have burned down the next day. But somehow he knew where everything was. But sadly, 3 years ago, I believe it's been 3 years ago, July, he passed away. And if you met Mr. Seabury, you wouldn't have guessed that he was married. I'm just saying he partied. He was having a good time. But apparently he was married. He just never got around to getting divorced. So when he passed away, apparently she remembered. So she showed up at the funeral, paperwork in hand, just in case there was a question. Mostly showing at the tourists, which I find interesting. But then there was like basically 2 years of litigation because a lot of people came out of the woodwork claiming to be somehow related. I believe there were even some DNA tests done, but in the end, it was hers. Now, what was hers was not the land and was not the building. It was the stuff on the front, the cool signs, and they really were, as well as all the stuff inside. And she sold that all at auction last October 1st. So unfortunately, if you go there today, it doesn't look like this, because I used to send tourists even after he passed away. It was just so cool to go visit. Well, I remember walking up to there a couple nights in the fall when there was live music, and literally cotton was right up against it, you know, a cotton field. And you're like walking, there's like cotton, there's this juke joint, and it was just surreal, just really surreal. But super nice, welcoming guy, even apparently liked us, I don't know. That's my buddy Jeff, by the way, who co-produced the films we've worked on. But he worked that land. So basically, with juke joints, you know, when someone dies, you think, oh, well, somebody's going to keep it going, you know. And in the case of Paul Monkey's, it was like that for at least 2 of the last 3 years. I would get regular phone calls, emails, Facebook messages. What's the latest on Paul Monkey's? And my answer was always, he's still dead. You know, it's an extension of the individual. I mean, it's not really a commercial business. I mean, there's business going on, but it really is an extension of the individual. And what I usually tell people with a juke joint, it's not, you know, they'll complain the hours aren't regular, or they can't find the phone number, or any number of things they can complain about. And I usually tell them, well, it's not really a club. It's a house party, but the owner doesn't really want you at his house. So he kind of has this other place. He just flicks on the lights and then charges you to come in and sells you whatever he sells you. And that's kind of how this was, except in his case, it actually was his house. He lived in the juke joint. So that's actually where they found him. So one of my absolute blues heroes, favorite characters, and man, he was a character I've ever met in my life. He was just super special, was Robert Bilbo Walker. So this is him 3 years ago maybe, and he made it to 80 years old, and he was known for his suits, like you see. It's kind of hard to see, you know, usually they're like colorful suits. I'm just going to say that's a wig. He had these puffy wigs, which I thought he only had one. Like for years, I thought he just had the one wig because it was very unique. And then he donated it to the Rock and Blues Museum. I'm like, well, now what are you going to do? And he's like, I got another one. So apparently he bought a gross of them. But I was very fortunate to be able to travel with him, get him gigs overseas. We went to Italy and Israel, Brazil. And of course, you know, you get these kind of fish out of water misadventures will happen. Brazil in particular was a notable, it was 2 weeks. I mean, spending 2 weeks with anybody, you know how it is. I mean, I don't care if it's your significant other or your best friend, you know, things are going to happen. But actually, he was great to travel with. And probably the strangest thing I had to personally do was at one point he forgot something in his luggage. I had to go up in the hotel room, and like, it's his little suitcase for 2 weeks. And he basically had 2 suits. So I'm like, I don't know what's in there. I kind of hate but I opened it up, and everything was so meticulously folded. It was like he worked somewhere where you did that for retail or something. He was a fascinating guy. And so during that 2 weeks, one of the festival events we played was in, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong. If you're from Brazil, I apologize. Caxias do Sul. If you're not from Brazil, that was exactly right. But it was this festival called the Mississippi Delta Blues Festival in Caxias do Sul, Brazil. I mean, how crazy is that? There was a bar there called the Mississippi either Blues Bar or Delta Blues Bar. I walk in, the trailer I just showed you, that movie was on the screen when I walked in on their big screen TV. There were pictures from right around Clarksdale on the walls, which is crazy, in Brazil. But at the festival, you know, he walked around, he had a particularly colorful suit and the wig, hadn't even performed yet, and people would just line up to get pictures taken with him. They just figured it's got to be somebody. They just didn't know who it was. So at one point, I had to step away to deal with some business and come back, and he's trying to charge people for the pictures. I'm like, no, you can't do that, you know. So then, maybe the next day, this continued to go on, and he's like, now, I don't mind taking pictures with the ladies, but do I have to take pictures with the guys? Like, you take pictures with everybody. You're a guest here. So we make it through 2 weeks of things, some of which I won't repeat since this may be on webcam or something. But last night, so every night for 2 weeks, basically, we'd eat out somewhere. And, oh, my Lord, I got so tired of just, I don't know why, there were like no vegetables, at least where we went, until like the last town had some broccoli for me. But at any rate, he would always get like chicken fried steak or whatever was similar to that. So he does the last night. Every night he would take it back to the room, put it in the fridge, apparently in the middle of the night, wake up, heat it up, and have a second dinner. It was like his thing. So the last night he gets his chicken fried steak, and it was a particularly large meal. Takes it back to his room. It's like, well, I'll see you in the morning. We're going to meet in the lobby. They'll drive us to the airport. We head back home after 2 weeks. So get down to the lobby in the morning, and I don't know if he was already there. Sit down, and we've talked ourselves out after 2 weeks. There's not a whole lot of small talk to make. So he's like, a weird thing happened to me last night. I'm like, okay, I'll bite. What happened? So it was about 2 a.m. I got up, and I was going to heat up that steak, So I got it out, and I put it in the microwave. I hit some buttons, and nothing happened. I hit the buttons again, and nothing happened. And then I couldn't get out of the microwave. And the whole time I was sitting there thinking, there's no microwave in my room, but there is a room safe. So we left Brazil with his chicken fried steak and his room safe. And he laughed all the way home. He was telling that story all the way home. I'm like, it's the weirdest microwave apparently ever, but it had buttons. But one of the things that came out, and I don't know if it was during that trip, at some point in time it came out that his lifelong dream, and he's a truly self-made man. I mean, he had survived a lot of things. He did not have an easy life. They sharecropped cotton and other things around Clarksdale. His father was an alcoholic. He was always an entrepreneur, finding different ways to make money. But if his dad knew he had the money, he'd always take it and drink it up. So in fact, he did not drink, which is, I'm just going to say, unusual in the blues world. But he was always trying to think of things, new businesses and whatever. Well, apparently his lifelong dream was to have his own juke joint. And at some point this came out. And then it's like somehow he managed to get a hold of a Quonset hut, a former army barracks somewhere in Mississippi. And he got a hold of a cotton trailer, cut it in pieces, and moved it to this little bit of property in the middle of nowhere, but only 18 minutes from downtown Clarksdale by car. So actually possible to make it work. It might have worked. Anyway, he puts it back together. You can see it actually in the background there. He puts it together. 7 years of work total. After about 5 years, maybe. Yeah, I think after about 5 years' work, he thought he was close to opening it. And we had the flooding up in the Delta. I don't know, it was 5 years ago now. We had this flooding, and I should back up and say, so he's building this Quonset hut juke joint. Well, he wanted to make it a complex. So he cleared all this land. It was crazy, all these trees. He got gravel and made a actually nice parking lot. He dug, these are air quotes again, fishing ponds, which were cesspools. I'm just going to be honest. They were just not big enough to be anything except they had a lot of mosquitoes. He had a boat in one that didn't exactly turn around, but it was in there. But he managed to stock it with fish, both those with fish, and this flood situation happens, and of course the water at some point goes over the bank, so the fish just swam out in the cotton fields, and that was that. So there were no more fish. Then that last year, before he opened, he built an outdoor stage, because he envisioned people coming and they would camp, and they'd fish, and they'd see a festival outside, and then you come inside the juke joint, this whole complex. Wonderlight City, if you can read that sign back there. And I always do this Wonderlight City, because it really was. He had thousands of lights out there in the end. It was ridiculous. Those don't attract mosquitoes in the country, I can tell you. So he just wanted to have this whole complex. So the stage outside, to make it easier, because he's running out of time really to get done what he wants done, he builds it like a tree house in between trees. Now the problem with that, if you know anything about trees, is they continue to grow. So like it was starting to get like this and everything. He's like, yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that, you know. So he had this whole thing. The concrete, he laid all that himself because he got a price quote. It was too much to do concrete, so he was like, I'll just do it myself. And finally, in June, I want to say it's 3 Junes ago now, he opened up Wonderlight City. And it was just the most amazing thing. Now, during the day, you couldn't be in there. It was too hot because the heat would just go right through that metal. But at night, it was these crazy lights, and he had the whole thing run off one household generator. The band, the lights, everything. He had reinvented how plumbing works, or doesn't always work, because there was no plumbing out there and no electricity. There's no water. So he had designed this toilet situation. There's no picture, don't worry. Designed this toilet thing back in the left, was the bathroom, where he'd fill it with a bucket from outside, and you get a couple flushes out of it, and it would, and I'm like, well, where's that going? So I just had to go back and look. So I followed the seam in the ground, and about 30 feet back, there's a pit. So I was like, well, we haven't tried that before. So, I say all this humorously because he was a very funny guy, and he'd probably get mad at me, but I think he'd appreciate it. But he really put his heart and soul into it, and he would try to figure out problems and try to figure out ways to do something with nothing. Now, sadly, it was only open for really 3 weeks, that really was open because he was diagnosed with cancer. And so he lived half the year out in Bakersfield, California. And I tell you all this because I talk about this. I got a whole chapter on Wonderlight City in the book. But it's not about the building that is a juke joint. It is about the juke joint people, both the customers, the musicians, and especially the owners, the proprietors. And I think to know more about a guy like this explains how you end up, late in life when you're 79, 80 years old opening a juke joint. But he lived half the year out in Bakersfield, California, because apparently in the 70s he got a gig out there once, a long-running gig that was going well. So he brought his wife out, and she loved it out there, and then the gig went away. So then he lived out there half the time, and then half the time in just outside of Clarksdale, between Clarksdale and Alligator, Mississippi, where this was. And the year before he finally opened a year late. You had the flood, and then the next year he had another mishap where he was driving back from California with a truck loaded with stuff for his juke joint, things for inside, I guess, and he was hauling another car behind him. As he described it, through a timing chain that started a fire on the side of the road. It was a whole disaster, but he managed to coast far enough away that he didn't get blamed for that. And so long story short, he got bamboozled by the tow truck guy they ultimately were able to get. And they stole the truck and everything in it, and he was left with this car to come back in. There's a whole lot more to that story. But he finally gets back to Clarksdale with his car. He's just glad to get back, this whole misadventure. He drives out to Wonderlight City to check on things, and somebody had cut the lock and stolen everything out of there. Sound equipment, refrigerator, the concrete mixer, generator, all this stuff. And he came by my store the next day, and he told, that's just a snippet of the story, the whole story. But what I loved about it is, he was mad, about some of it, but also he had a sense of humor about it. He wasn't going to have a heart attack over this. I mean, he really was just one more bump in the road, and I'll get past this too. When he left my store that day, of course, he was going to look for everybody who had stolen his stuff, so I kind of pity them if he found them, because... but in the end, he had it for 3 weeks. It was open, went out to Bakersfield, California. He came back one more time and performed, and he passed away that November, which is just, these larger-than-life figures, be it Elvis or be it Bilbo Walker, very similar, believe it or not. I mean, just these larger-than-life. They walk in a room, and it is not the same room. It's just so hard to believe when they're gone. Like Willie Seabury, Paul Monkey, same thing. But I was lucky enough, as I said, to be able to travel with Bilbo. So this is him on a big stage in Israel, wearing his white suit. And in Brazil on the small stage, and then the next night was on the big stage, which had the big screen and all that, which was pretty cool. And that's the one that was the Mississippi Delta Blues Festival. He also was a regular at Red's Lounge. That's where I saw him the most. And it never got old. I mean, he had the songs that he did his way. It's not like he was out, learning new songs. He was doing the stuff he learned in the 50s and 60s, and that was enough. So, but I never got tired of it because he always did things in different ways, had his little quirks in the way he played. And if you ever got to see him, his signature really towards the end of a gig, he'd do some duck walking, Chuck Berry duck walking. Although, as he pointed out, Chuck Berry could only go forward. Bilbo could go forward and reverse. But then the thing that blew my mind the first time I saw him, because I've just never seen anybody do it before or since, he's playing a Fender Stratocaster or some kind of knockoff of that style guitar. It's a heavy guitar. To hold it with one hand like this, just to hold it, is not something you'd want to do, really. He's holding it and playing it. Like he had this whole little song thing worked out. He could play it where he's holding it. He'd take the strap off. He's doing this, and he'd lay it on the ground. He'd dance around with the guitar. And to see that in a juke joint like a Reds or a Wonderlight City, or in Brazil when he did it, he had a particular riff he'd start playing. And what was crazy is, and I don't know how many folks in the audience could speak English, so maybe that's why they didn't sing along with the songs, they started singing that riff back to him. It was like this ocean of it. It was the craziest thing. I just never seen anything like it. But he had that kind of magnetic juke joint personality. But this is Reds he's standing out front of in Clarksdale. That's Red Payton. I'll say in better days. He's had some health issues and stuff. He's all right, but he's had some health issues. But he basically, I love this because he's right next to his tip jar, because he's always about the money. It's like basically everything's cool as long as nobody messes with my money. But if you've been in Reds, one of the features you'll note, in modern times at least, is this interesting plastic ceiling situation. That's because about, I don't know, it's probably 8 years ago, at least now, he had, for a couple years, some real water issues, to the point that one night I came in there, and so it's raining and coming through, and the pool table at that point was actually a pool. I mean, I'm not exaggerating, it was full of water, so it's gone now. But it was down to having shot glass here and a wine glass that catching drops. It was so out of control. But he put up this plastic. Once he couldn't stop it on top, he just tried to stop it inside, which generally would work, but occasionally would just release on the drummer, for example. And then one night, Robert Wolfman Belfour was playing, which if you ever got to see him, just one of the greatest of the Hill Country bluesmen. And he played that Hill Country blues, which was like a groove. So you're in the groove, you're locked in, and the songs can be half an hour long, So you're in the zone. But I caught something, my peripheral vision is pretty good, and I caught something movement up to the left towards the door. So I turned, and there's Red, who should not be on a stepladder anyway. He wears sunglasses in the dark. He's on a stepladder with a wet dry vac trying to vacuum out the ceiling, which you couldn't hear because the music's loud. And I'm like, okay, that's a juke joint. But it is basically fixed now. He had a little issue back in the spring where I was at the bar and I was talking to Big Charles, the bartender, and I could hear water. I'm like, is there water running? And of course, he gave me some non-answer. Well, it turned out all the water was coming back, and they drilled a little hole so it all came through the same spot and going into a huge garbage can. And I'm thinking, how are you going to get that garbage can out of here, honestly? But he has fixed it since. But that is the precarious nature of juke joints, is whether, knock on wood, at the owner's health or the building. Fortunately, thankfully, and I'll use Clarksdale as the example, our city government has either just not cared, and I'll take that, or they have cared and said, you know what, we're going to kind of grandfather in some of the code enforcement because, it's not very codey in there, let's just say. Before I forget, so James T. Model Ford, one of the juke joint guys. But before I forget, Dr. Edgar Smith is here in the audience, and he reminded me of this incredible program that is through the Mississippi Blues Trail. Everybody knows about the Mississippi Blues Trail markers, I assume. There's over 200 of them now, mostly in Mississippi, but some are outside where things Mississippi connected happen, and hopefully that draws people to our state. But it's a program you can donate to, and that money goes to help Bilbo Walker, actually in death, to help pay for funeral expenses. James T. Model Ford in life, guys like Cadillac John Nolden, Big Boy Martin Grant, Robert Wolfman Belfour, Anthony Big A. Sherrod. A lot of these bluesmen have actually benefited, be it dental work, funeral arrangements, medicines. So it's a really great program, and I have one brochure which I'm happy to share, or Dr. Smith has more, or you can just go to msbluestrail.org, msbluestrail. Yeah, there he is. I was looking, I couldn't see you. That's Dr. Smith right there. msbluestrail.org, and you can actually go there to connect as well. Or if you're a musician or you know a musician, a blues musician who is in need, you can actually apply through the website. And it is a great program. You know, sometimes you don't know where your money's going. Like, well, I'm going to donate, but I don't know what that's really going towards. Well, this you know. So I'm a huge fan because it's helped friends of mine. So this is James T. Model Ford, another juke joint legend. His backstory, and you know, again, he's in the book. He's actually in both books, my previous book as well. And his backstory is just as colorful as his music was and his personality. He was, Mississippi born, of course, ended up in Greenville, Mississippi for the longest period of time. Didn't start playing blues till he was 58 years old, is what he always said. No way to check that. But made it to possibly 93 years old, although none of the paperwork matched, frankly. But he's married 6 times, had at least 26 kids, served time in a chain gang, although, as he put it, he cut me first. So eventually, after 2 years, his mother was able to get an attorney and got him off the chain gang situation. But, you know, you hear all those things, and they're colorful, you know, anecdotes, and it makes them, you know, just kind of bigger than life again. But that's how he sounded, too. Like, his music sounded like a guy who had gone through all that, who'd really made something out of nothing, had survived truly hard times, was always a hard worker, never a complainer, sort of like Bilbo Walker, just real entrepreneurs within their chosen field. And he played all kinds of juke joints. And there's some good little stories and anecdotes, I think, in the book. John Horton, who's a living bluesman, really great down in Greenville, Mississippi. I have a little interview snippet in the book from him where he's like, yeah, you know, T. Model Ford and Willie Foster and such, you know, they picked me up one night and we're driving to this gig, and Willie Foster says, well, I feel like fighting tonight. And T. Model's like, well, I hope it isn't me, you know, and whips out his gun and is like, what? But, you know, just guys that were ready to go. And Terry Harmonica Bean, if you've heard of him, he's played down here for the Mississippi Blues Marathon before, for example, at Pontotoc, Mississippi. His first break playing blues was playing with T. Model on Nelson Street in Greenville, where there used to be a bunch of juke joints. And he said, yeah, I just had to stop playing with him because I was taking the punches. You know, he'd get the thing going and I would take the punches. So just real colorful characters. So it looks like it's about 11 till. So I'm going to flash through a couple more photos, and then we'll take some questions. There's T. Model. And man, he was a character. I had him in New York City one time for a gig in Brooklyn. And they put us up at a fancy Manhattan hotel, because I guess they had a deal with the hotel. And so we had to get from the Manhattan hotel to Brooklyn for the nighttime gig. I had a bunch of other musicians, so we had to take this van. They're taking us through Chinatown, and T. Model's in the front, and the younger musicians are in the back with me, and my buddy Jeff was there. And I don't know if that's the most efficient way to go, but it is a way to go through Chinatown. So we're going through Chinatown, and T. Model turns around. I'm like, oh, please don't say something terrible, like maybe my grandfather might have said, or something, you know, going through, saying lots of Chinese Americans and signage and everything. Of course, the young guys are all snapping photos with their flip phones, you know. He turns around and says, would you look at all the Mexicans? So, you know, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just funny. It's like, well, okay. But a character and a half. So there is a chapter on moonshine. I don't recommend drinking moonshine. I'm just documenting things. This is the late Leo Bud Welch, and I won't say what's in that cup. This R.L. Boyce, the guy in the very lower right holding the guitar, he actually is being celebrated in Como, Mississippi this weekend. If you find yourself in Como, you can go to my cathead.biz website. I have a music calendar, has details, or the msbluestrail.org calendar does as well. But he is an instant party. Like, he shows up and it's suddenly a party. It can be raining. It doesn't have to be actually other people there. He's just a real juke joint guy. And his wife, Sheila, she can take anybody in the room. Juke Joint Festival I mentioned earlier in April. Come see us in Clarksdale. I've got magnets over here. Celebrates juke joint culture. 13 daytime stages, 22 nighttime venues. Monkeys riding dogs as well. Out of Pontotoc, Mississippi. Don't judge us. So, but this is this year's, you know, the festivals we have in Clarksdale. Again, a lot of them involving juke joints. And of course, I have to plug the books. So, The newest one is the one on the right with the red cover. And if you have questions, then Chris has a microphone. He'll come bring the microphone to you, and that way folks who are watching at home, wherever they're watching, will be able to hear the question as well.
So we're actually going to be in Clarksdale tomorrow night. Where should we go?
So tomorrow's Thursday, so I know offhand for sure Ground Zero Blues Club at 8 o'clock. And if you come by Cathead during the day, I can tell you what else is going on. Or if I'm closed, I hang some of my little flyers out front, Sounds Around Town. Or you can go to cathead.biz again, look at the calendar.
I'm going to put in a quick plug for a new hotel that's opened up there, the Travelers Hotel.
Oh, yeah, fabulous. Yeah.
I saw it a few nights ago. I was up there, and so we'll be staying there, so that should be fun.
Fantastic. And they had Lucius Spiller playing live blues this past Friday in the lobby. Yeah, which is cool. I'll make sure.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, why is it that the blues, this kind of music started, and the poorest part of Mississippi, which is itself a very poor state, but the Delta is even poorer. How come this brilliant music started in such the poorest part of Mississippi? It seems to me as if, where there's little education, the disfranchisement and the terror of the Klan and all kinds of difficulties. How is it that in these conditions you have such brilliant music taking place, which has become widespread, national, and even international? And I'm wondering, most of these brilliant blues musicians ended up so poor.
So I personally feel like the music it only could have come from there. If you've heard the content of many blues songs, but also just the feel, particularly earlier blues music, it's a pressure valve, it's laughing to keep from crying, it's sort of a poor person psychiatrist kind of situation, or even songs about that. I think it kind of had to come from that experience, and absolutely, and speaking particularly with older blues players and juke joint people, but also other just older people around Clarksdale through time and the Delta, and hearing the stories, it's just unbelievable that anybody could survive under those conditions, let alone contribute such an important thing to the history of the world, this music and this art. On the other hand, it's kind of like, well, you had to do something to survive all that, and it seems to me that's what this is, that music. It's not, the protest music that came later with soul music and hip-hop and things. It really is more of, trying to survive something, I think, particularly early on. In modern times, it is more of a pop music in many ways, because when there finally was money to be made, early on, certainly there was some, in many cases, money made, and not always by the artists. That it took time, really, the whole music industry as a whole, to, I guess, get that under control with publishing rights and things like that. But you look at guys like Charlie Patton, who was born in probably the late 1880s, the first significant recording bluesman to come out of Mississippi. And you hear like what he sings about, and you hear how he performs it, how he sings it. You hear about how here's a guy that in the 20s was playing an acoustic guitar behind his head and between his legs, and he's down on the floor, trying to entertain crowds that, were working cant to cant, 6 days a week, and you got Saturday night and Sunday morning, and that's pretty much it. So, you're really going to let off some steam. But that's how I view it anyway.
I think Roger more or less answered the question. But as someone who lived in the Delta, next door to the biggest juke joint in the town, and picked the cotton, chopped the cotton, etc. I was 85 2 weeks ago. The blues actually enabled the folk to maintain their sanity. Otherwise, they'd go stone crazy. When you mentioned the steam valve, that's true.
when you think in terms of what the folk were doing all the week, working like hell, I mean, for pennies. I mean, I've picked cotton for $2 £100, okay? All righty? And actually, that was a lot of money in those days, okay? Some people have done less than that. You were subjected to all kinds of harassment during the week. If you didn't have a steam valve to let that out, that's why when someone mentioned there was some cutting and shooting going on, they couldn't cut and shoot the person they really wanted to cut and shoot, so they would cut and shoot themselves, okay? That in terms of the music, there was no way in which they could express themselves during slavery like they really wanted to. So they did the spirituals and the gospels. They really couldn't talk unless they would do it in code, okay? But coming at the end of slavery, around 1890, when the blues really actually began, people could really begin to express themselves, really express what their feelings were. So it was a matter of expression, and it came out of the Delta because that was the greatest concentration of black folk in the Delta who were actually experiencing those kinds of situations. So that's why it came out of the Delta. Now, they weren't doing it for profit then, okay? They were doing it in terms of relief. When people discovered there was a profit being made, they still didn't profit from it. And they were still poor because they were really uneducated in many instances and didn't have the wherewithal to provide for the copywriting, what have you. Hence, that's why this fund is available now, because many of these musicians have come along, made that music, other folk have profited from it, they don't have money to bury themselves. Now, that's why we have this fund. So that, in essence, is why the blues derived in the Delta, in the Mississippi Delta. That was the place, that was the ground zero, okay? Thank you for it to happen. And so that was, in essence, I mean, I could talk for a long time, but I won't. But in essence, well, he mentioned the church. You know, I actually, they could talk, during slavery and prior slavery, people could have the gospel songs, the spiritual songs, this is what I was saying. But they could not really express themselves unless they did it in code. And the blues was doing it also. Many times when they're talking about a woman or something, they're talking about the man. Okay, so that was the way in which they actually expressed themselves. We expressed ourselves.
I think this lady right here was trying to, yeah.
Did Cat's Head have a dinette inside to eat at?
No, I know how to cook, but I don't serve any food now. So it's a blues store. So anything blues related, books and music and artwork and things of that nature. And again, it's in part just an excuse to get people to walk in and I can tell them what I think they need to go do and see and what they need to hear that night, and a place to sort of organize things from. Ma'am, oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks for coming. Do we really support the blues in Mississippi? It feels like a lot of it's kind of a caricature of what's come out of it, the way it is now. And I'm always wondering if we could really support it, you know, in a more meaningful way.
So I'll answer two ways. The state, it took a while, I think, to recognize blues as being the tourism draw that it is. And because of that, to then celebrate the history. But the state really has come around. The Mississippi Blues Trail system, people come just to see those blues trail markers. And many of the towns, certainly throughout the Delta, have them. In some cases, Clarksdale has multiple markers that document people, places, things that happened in blues. And I think that's really important. It's an element that those of us kind of in the private industry couldn't do. We couldn't go out and put up a bunch of markers. I think the benevolent fund is fantastic. Would it have been nice to have had that, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years, whatever, sure. But that shouldn't stop us from trying to really grow these things now. The music itself and the general public, I think that's where it fell down for a bit. Where without, honestly, and this is the truth, Reds is a good example just because I go there all the time. Without tourism, without blues fans coming from around the US and really from around the whole world, he would not have music. He might be open as a bar, but he would not be doing regular music. His primary customer had kind of died off, and a younger local generation was not coming to that music, or at least coming to that kind of a venue to see the music. So I think as people, just us here in this room, if we all have one homework assignment for this month, go out and see a blues show somewhere. Go support a club, spend money there. If you don't drink, that's totally fine. Buy a water. I always tell people that, like Reds, that's how he makes his money off the bar. Buy a water. Tip, at the bar. Tip the musician. That's how we really keep it going. And, $1 for me to tip $1, well, if 50 people tip it, that's 50 more bucks that musician goes home with that night. So it really does add up. I think.
Well, yeah, actually, we have gone past the top of another hour. I know there are more questions. I find that in line to buy a copy of the book is always an excellent place to ask those. Thank you all for coming today. I hope that we'll see you back here next Wednesday for Max Garriott. We have copies of several of Roger's books for sale over here. He'll be glad to answer any of the questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you all for coming. Help me thank Roger Stolle for the program today.